For the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. All right, so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to attempt to get through Judges 12. I know you may laugh at that, but it actually is, there's a lot of retelling that happens, not just in Judges 12, but also in parts of 13. So we're not going to have to spend a lot of time trying to decipher what's happening because you'll already know what's happening, and so that'll be good. So we're ending with Jephthah, finishing out Jephthah, and then what we call the minor judges, I think is what most of the commentators that I read after I finished my study, I went back through and was looking at this, and I'm like, oh, they're the minor judges. And I think actually some headings that man has put in calls them the minor judges. I don't know how minor they are. We just don't have a lot of story that's attached to them. So I think anybody who has been anointed by God is pretty major. So we're going to start in Judges 12. We're going to read Judges 12:1, and then we'll kind of move through and kind of hit this piece by piece, okay? Judges 12. And the men of Ephraim were gathered together and passed northward, and they said unto Jephthah, Wherefore passest thou over to fight against the children of Ammon, and didst not call us to go with thee? We will burn thy house upon thee with fire. All right. So I don't know if he is in his house and they have come to him. I don't know if this is a threat to do it. There is some speculation that he has been done with the battle already. He is talking to them in his house. There's also some discussion that maybe they are threatening to do this to him later on. I really don't care. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of the story. Both can happen, and it's not that big of a deal. What's more of a big deal is, has this happened before? When has this happened?
Gideon.
With Gideon. What was Gideon's response? Y'all remember what Gideon's response was to them? And this is important.
He was basically like, didn't you do some of the hardest work? Because they were the ones who ended up killing the princes Oreb and Zeb.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of flatters them with what they did.
Yeah, flatters them, even pacifies them. They're going to end up actually getting something for doing this. And I really think that this is part of the issue. Sometimes we think, wow, I got away with that. I can do it again. And I don't know if it was God's choice. It was obviously Gideon's choice to do that. But God is not going to suffer this, especially not with Jephthah. And so, yes, Gideon did give them a little extra and maybe dealt with them in a much different way. But here, that is not what's going to happen. All right, verse 2. And Jephthah said unto them, I and my people were at a great strife with the children of Ammon. And when I called you, you saved me not out of their hand. Now, obviously this happened. Jephthah called them and they did not answer. Now, we don't have a lot of record on that. It could have happened in a lot of different places in the story. It doesn't matter. It obviously happened and they did not come. And yet they still want some of the spoils. They're trying to get a leg up. Ephraim has been causing major problems and will continue to cause major problems all the way up through the line of David. And actually that we're going to talk about what's going to end up happening as a result of this. Some things are set in motion as a result of their actions and what will happen to them. All right. And then in verse 3 and 4, and when I saw that ye saved me not, I put my life in my hand and passed over against the children of Ammon, and Jehovah delivered them into my hand. Wherefore then are ye come up unto me this day to fight against me? Then Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim, and the men of Gilead smote Ephraim. Folks, this is a bit of a civil war. Yep. Because they said, ye are fugitives of Ephraim, ye Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim, in the midst of Manasseh. What is the accusation here?
Well, I mean, the Gileadites and the people that Jephthah had gathered were kind of the outcasts. They were called the workless men originally. They were probably the thieves, not that that's the wrong word. They were probably like the pirates of that time. They kind of went out and they did what they had to survive, and they were probably pretty good at fighting, and they just won a major battle. And it seems like they're kind of accusing them of being the trashy people. You're the leftovers. You're the worthless people. And, I think it's funny that the people accusing them of that are kind of they're the blisters. They show up every time something's been done after the work's been done and want to know, we were willing to go out and fight. Why didn't you call us? And like you said, they got away with it with Gideon, but not this time.
Yeah, I'm going to come right back to that. One of the things that reminded me of is I knew a guy, and his favorite thing to do was to think about when somebody that he knew that people couldn't come, then he would invite them over. Because he knew what their answer was going to be. Right? Let's wait till 8 o'clock and we'll say something. And then we know they're not going to come. And we have to be careful of doing this, being insincere in the things that we say and that we do. And obviously, we're not going to have Jephthah and his group come after us. But you being insincere and not authentic with the love that you have for one another can become a dangerous thing. And what we're going to find out is here for the Ephraimites, I mean, they essentially are going to be not completely cleaned out, but eventually they're going to lay the groundwork for the Philistines to stick around all the way until the day of Maccabees. And if you think about that, that's 1,000 years. So because of this, they're not going to be able to be in that land. And that was something that was really, really strange to me, to think that the Philistines and the religious cult that they hooked in and the Israelites were worshiping lasted for 1,000 years. And the fact that so many of these Ephraimites were killed as a result of being basically insincere and trying to get something over on their brothers. Don't be that way in the church for sure. Yes?
Well, I find it interesting that in just the entire canon of the Bible, how things take 500 years, 1,000 years, 3,000 years, and here we are in this modern day and time. We're so important that if we don't get 30 likes on Facebook, our world is going to end. And when God's talking in thousands of years before freedom or peace or prosperity is going to come, and we're sitting here in our own little bubbles going, oh my goodness, who's going to give me this today to make me feel fulfilled?
Yeah.
And it's not about any one individual. It's about the whole body of the church.
Well, and actually, we're going to come to that. I'm going to come talk about that in just a second as we get towards the end of this. I think there's another application that is tied to that. And it is something that sometimes we only want, and I'll preface it right now, and then we're going to wait and come back to it. But we always want what we want right now. Mm-hmm. We are only concerned about what we want right now. And as the church, we cannot be concerned about what we want, but what God wants. And we have to be very careful about pushing agendas or things that are selfish, self-centered, but it's also not just, let's say it's not selfish necessarily and self-centered, but we think, I guess in the way that it still is, but we want things right now. There's an entitlement that happens here. And all you have to do is step back for a moment and look at what we're reading, and you can see it across the pages. And that is what causes problems. And it doesn't cause problems just back then. It's going to continue to cause problems even in the church today. People need to wait for a moment and think, just because I only can see this picture, God's larger picture is already happening. He's already done this. And we've talked about this time and time again. I think that's what Jeff had brought up a few classes ago. But God has already been victorious. Be careful of what you're trying to get. Whether it's won over or whatever, be careful. All right, so one more thing back to what Aaron was saying. So I did remember. Were they there, the Ephraimites, when Gilead came down before God and for the elders? No. All they know is, here is Gilead with his band of brigands, who are out there, whether you call them Robin Hoods or whatever you want to call them, but they probably don't understand what that whole thing was. And it wasn't for them to understand. This was between God, and it was between the elders, and it was between Jephthah. And I think that's what's important here, is that they were making this statement. They don't understand, I think, from reading this. I don't think they would have had the idea to understand what was happening. Remember that Jephthah was the head of all of the Gileadites, and this is what they are saying to him. It's a mistake. And I think that's another great lesson for us. Be careful what you say and who you say it to. Your limited knowledge, you may not have any understanding about who people are and what they're doing. I've heard folks, because they can't see the way that someone works in the church, destroy them to someone else. You have no idea. And honestly, you're not supposed to necessarily have an idea of what people are doing behind the scenes. Left hand, right hand. You don't have a clue. You need to step back for a second and honor one another. And I think that's the problem. We don't see that honoring that we're told about in the church. We just don't see it here. And it doesn't matter whether they knew or not. The fact is that they're saying this, and this is what they're doing, and it's going to cause a problem. All right, so let's continue. Anybody else want to add anything to this? Aaron?
I would just like to say, I was just thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of interesting. Gideon avoided having to do this by using a little bit of tact and a little, by using a little sugar instead of the stick, or the carrot instead of the stick. But he kind of kicked the can down the road so that Jephthah had to deal with it. He didn't have a whole lot of carrot. He just went straight to the stick.
Yeah, and in that way, it maybe is a good lesson for us too, to be careful about shoving problems and conflict underneath the rug. Let's just go ahead and push it off for another day. I will tell you from my own experience, that does not turn out well. What seems to be something very minor at the time, if it's dealt with immediately, probably we're not going to have to deal again in that same way. They can become mountains for us. And that can come in your own personal life, but that can also come with the church. So if there is an issue, you must deal with it immediately, in the right kind of way, but deal with it immediately so that we're not dealing with it later on down the road. Roger?
Yeah, I could be wrong, but when you look back to the whole context of 11 and 12, and you look at where we're at here, chapter 12, I don't think it was just Jephthah and those men that he had gathered around him back before the elders of Gilead came to ask him to come and help them with the children or the war of Ammon. I think when we look at the whole message, when he left, he was an outcast, no doubt about it. And yes, there were some vain men that gathered around him. People kind of attract things like that. But after that, I believe Jephthah was leading Gilead, not just these vain men. I don't know if they're
Absolutely.
anymore.
Absolutely.
And so the problem here with Ephraim is simply jealousy. Here's these Gileads or Gileadites that were out there and they were taking and winning this war. And so it's like, now they want to be a part of it. Why didn't you include us? And so there's where we have the story of the message now in chapter 12, where now Jephthah's going to have to deal with the Ephraimites. And it's a good lesson for us, because I think you started the lesson. It's not about us. It's about God. And so here Gilead and here Jephthah is being blessed by God, and he's doing what should be done or the right thing. And so that's a good lesson for us, is that it's not about us. It's about God, as you started the lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to think that y'all think that there's this little group that he's had up in Tob and they're the only ones fighting. We know that's not true. We know that he gathers up there. But we're talking about the perception And it could easily be that they're just jealous and they're saying something. They're like, okay, well, we know what his past has been. Let's bring up his past and deal with it, which is another great lesson too for us, right? Is be careful about bringing up people's past against them instead of encouraging and doing things for the Lord. So, I mean, we can even gather that. So I don't know that I was ever, it's a great point. I wasn't trying to say that it was just this little band that was doing all this. We know from the story that there is a whole group here that are going out to fight. But it is the discussion. Maybe it's a perception. Maybe it's only that they're jealous and they're thinking about what can I say to incite him. Maybe I can say something horrible that he'll just give in like Gideon did, or maybe they want to fight. We're not really told about that. What we're told about is the actual fight that's going to occur. And so before we actually begin the next section in 5 to 7, we're going to be reading about a ford. That doesn't mean that there's a Bronco down there at the river. What is a ford?
It's a place where you cross in the river.
Okay, it's a place to cross in the river. Anybody else know any more about a ford?
You're trying to divert water, or trying to like, work around the water or utilize the water or whatever. I mean, it's a man-made construction around the water.
Okay, it can be a man-made construction. It can just be a shallow place along the river, which usually is a great way to create a beachhead and then attack from. It's an area, so basically they're controlling any way to cross the river. And I think that's what's important here. The ford is a place where they were going to be able to cross the river, and they're going to set up camp right there where they're going to cross the river. So it's important for us to understand what this looks like. It's this footing area, and they're going to stop them. If not, they're going to have to swim. They're going to have to do some other things to get across the river. So verse 5 to 7. And the Gileadites took the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites, and it was so that when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, let me go over, the men of Gilead said unto them, art thou an Ephraimite? If he said, nay, then said they unto him, say now, Shibboleth. And he said, Sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they laid hold on him and slew him at the fords of the Jordan. And there fell at that time of Ephraim 42,000. That is a lot of people, folks. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years, and then died Jephthah the Gileadite and was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. All right, so we've got 42,000 that's dead. That's a lot of people, by the way. If you're talking about major armies, and I've told you this before, during this period, having 10 or 20,000 is a big army at this time. That's a lot of people. We don't see this historically. We don't even see 100,000 or 200,000 until the Assyrians, who actually kind of invent the mass army, okay? And so when we talk about this, 42,000 is a lot of people. Significantly stopping the Ephraimites probably of ever causing a major problem from here on out. Obviously, there's going to be a remnant. There's going to be people that are left, but they're not going to have the same push that they're having at this time. Why Shibboleth? Why Shibboleth? What's happening here?
It's a name or it's a word that when said, you will know whether or not, because it's said in the colloquialism of the Ephraimites. If it's said that way, then you would know that they were Ephraimites, and if it's said in a different way, you'll know that they are not.
Yes, this is a problem. So I actually looked up the word Shibboleth just to see if there was something with the word a stream in a flood, ear of corn, whatever. There's meanings, but it doesn't really seem to be about the meaning of the word. And I always try to check the text to see what that is. If you have your Bibles, turn over to Matthew 26:73. Matthew 26:73. We see another account of something like this in Matthew 26:73. 26:73 says, after a little while, the bystanders came up to and said to Peter, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you. What's betraying him? His ability his speech. They were unable to pronounce the sh. There's a lot of kids as they come up and they grow up that sh It's a very difficult thing for them to, that and TH, right, the TH. In fact, during World War II, the Dutch underground were able to screen out German spies by having them say the Dutch city of, I gotta remember this, Scheveningen, I can't even say it, Scheveningen. I even looked it up and said it like 10 times last night. Scheveningen. Okay, we're gonna stop. Anyway, but the Germans struggled to pronounce the TH in the right way in the word, and so as soon as they knew that, they would kill the German spy from sneaking in, and this is why the Dutch underground was able to do all they did all the way throughout the war. They could pick out German spies simply based upon what they said. So that's why they have this word, or this word that they're using here, is to make sure, and they were trying to catch every Ephraimite as it crossed. And so we talk about this, allowing for God's timing to play out and for God to bless you and wanting what you want. Proverbs 20:24 says, a man's steps are from the Lord. How then can man understand his way? And 1 Peter 5:5 says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourself, all of you, in the humility towards God. For God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. We did not get together last night on that. He opposes the proud. Who were the proud in this? Ephraim. And he gives grace to the humble. Israel still needed to be unified. They still needed to come back to the Lord. They're still going to need a temple to be built. And here the Ephraim, the divisive problem, was dealt with. And whether it was the judge's decision that God's appointed or whether it was God, it still was dealt with. Michael?
I think it's an example of what Jesus said about fruits and trees, to know them by their fruits. And this is something that has come up over and over again. With what was done earlier with Gideon, it was a pride thing, a jealousy thing. And man, it just seems like Ephraimites were bandwagon folks. That whenever they were winning, it's like, oh, hey, we'll be on the team. That's not always the case, but sometimes. But you'll know people by their fruits. If they're a proud and arrogant bunch, then they're going to reap the benefits of that, or the destruction of that over time. And people who do wrong, yeah, they might escape for a time, but often they end up repelling people, and they turn people away. And it ends up that even if that's not the case, even if they succeed their whole life, God knows, and God will determine, and God will judge.
Yes.
And so, we want to make sure that the activities we're involved in, the things we do, are going to bear good fruit, and then let the results speak for themselves. Let the fruit speak for themselves, rather than, trying to, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me. Just worrying about doing what's right.
And one of the things I think that's just such a great lesson, and it comes back to this idea of God's timing on everything. You can look at this and go, wow, 42,000 people dead. And yet we don't have the knowledge of what's coming, and we don't understand what's going to happen and what's necessary and what's going to, and so you can read, sometimes you read these passages and go, why? Not just for the immediate action about what's going to come. Bob Perkins and I talked this week, and it was good to see Bob. But one of the things that he and I both started in our discussion was talking about how we can set ourselves up for problems if we are trying to direct God to doing what we think should happen in the moment. And what was coming up was talking about us going out and reaching the lost. And so I'm gonna just for a moment here move us sideways. We're gonna come right back to it, but I just want to make sure we touch on this, because I think it's such a powerful message. We can want different things all we want in the church. We can want this to happen, and we can want that to happen, and we can say, well, we want this building, or we want to be able to go do this, and why haven't we done more here, or why haven't we done more here? And I think considering all of that, that's fine. Well, yeah, we have this program right here, but we really need to be doing this and this, because we need to make sure we get more people in there. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should desire to see more people baptized. We should desire that people know the message. We should desire to do those things. But God's timing is on God's time. We are out there to plant the seed. And he and I both were talking. I guess he had gone to the Ukraine and I had gone to Hungary. And we had talked about how there was one baptism in those trips, and 6 weeks, one baptism. You come home and you feel just kind of deflated, because you want it to be one of those things where you come in and there's, 500 people or, whatever. We had hundreds of people a day that were having Bible studies. And one of the things that we got to understand is that God has this already worked out. He has his own timing. We're going to plant the seed. That's what we should go do. But we shouldn't be the one trying to direct God's steps. And I think that's the part that I was going to come back to, is we don't know what's going to happen in 10, 15, or 20 years. We don't know what's going to happen next year. But what we do know is what we're supposed to do. And we have to be careful of trying to direct God or trying to direct our lives in such a way where we are the ones trying to dictate. That's not our place. It's going to end up really causing problems. And a lot of times what it ends up causing is more being selfish of what I want. And it can even be with people who have a desire for the church to do good. We can be so excited and we can be zealous and we can still do wrong. Be careful. Do your job, do your role, do the things that God has asked you to do. And I couldn't help but tie this into today's lesson. Michael made a comment that typically if you're so proud, God's probably not going to be able to use you. And he gave the disclaimer probably, and because I leaned over to Stephen, because Stephen's like, well, I'm not sure, Dad. And I'm like, yeah, because you think about Paul when he was Saul and how righteous he saw himself as being in his endeavors and how zealous he was. And in his being zealous, he was doing bad things. Be careful what you're doing and what you're saying to other people. Be careful if you are working for God, God will take care of the rest. You are not to be directing God's steps and God's plan and his will, because, folks, most of us don't know what that is. We just have to work. We have to do what we're asked to do, which is to go and to work.
You can also wear yourself out doing a million good things that do not meet the big picture. You can get a whole team together to go do lots of little good things that on the big picture don't help anything. There's maybe one best thing, or let's figure out what the 5 things are that will benefit the most people or a specific person. I know people who are exhausted constantly, but they're always doing good works. But it doesn't get them anywhere because they don't look at a bigger picture, and they run out of steam, and they run out of their own zeal for Christ because it doesn't make a difference. It is making a difference, but they're not seeing it because they're just so busy in the little picture.
And I think that that's actually expressed in Hebrews 12 when we're told to persevere, and talks about this more being a race, or at least it illustrates a race that's a more long term, not a sprint. And I knew people who become baptized and they're on fire. I mean, they are. And for 6 months, 8 months, a year, they are like, it's like their head's on fire. They are out doing everything. They got little boxes that they check. Look at what I did this week. I mean, they're trying to quantify. And it's not that we shouldn't try to do what we can. And my sermon from 2 weeks ago, right? I mean, we want to give an effort that meets or tries to get to 100%. We want to do that. But be careful that you're not trying to just do a whole bunch of little things here and there. You want to make sure that the goal is that you are becoming more spiritually minded, you're maturing, you can do a little bit here and there. And we shouldn't also, likewise, on the flip side of that, we should be careful not to belittle what someone else is doing, because that might be their talent and that might be what they are in the church, and that might be what they are, and they may be doing more good than you could ever imagine. We don't want to be like the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians, trying to figure out what the best gifts are. Well, look at what that person's doing because it's more showy or something else. We have to be very, very careful with what we're trying to do. Understand, again, it comes back to do your job. Do your role. You are a Christian just like everybody else. You're going to do your thing. You're going to do your talent. You're going to be part of the body. Do what you can do. But understand that in anything, God is going to be using that. God is going to be working towards his will. He's going to have his plan on his time. And all we need to do is to do what we're supposed to do. Don't go beyond that. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying that you shouldn't strive to improve yourself, or that you shouldn't strive to do better each day. Or that's not what we're saying. Be careful about what you're esteeming as something good for yourself and other people, and also being critical about that. Just do what you're supposed to be doing. We all should be out working. By the way, also, as a side note, this usually is followed by this, right? Gossiping, stabbing people in the back, doing bad things like that. We don't want to be talkers. We want to be doers. Be careful that you're not flapping your lips, criticizing other people, or saying what it should be, or this or that or the other. You have a responsibility to do. And if you're doing, probably this is going to stop. So it's a great lesson. It's a great side note for us to be thoughtful of. Let's go ahead and finish the last 7. Did you want to say something there? And I saw your hand. No? Okay, just want to make sure. All right. Let's read Judges 12, 8 through 15. So these are what have been deemed as the minor judges, right? Minor, whatever that means. And after him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. Does that mean that he's from the real Bethlehem or one of the other Bethlehem? It doesn't matter. Judged Israel. And he had 30 sons, 30 daughters he sent abroad, and 30 daughters he brought in from abroad for his sons. And he judged Israel 7 years, and Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem. So I think this is an interesting point. Some people really like to make a big deal that he brought people abroad for his children. If we follow the pattern that we set from the beginning, that as you went down the list of judges, they tended to have more problems. They tended to do worse things, right? They tended to go, and so I often wonder, we don't know, these people he brought in for his children are from abroad. It doesn't say he's from this particular place or that place. Are they pagans, if you will, or are they from the house? Yes.
The ESV says outside his clan.
His clan. Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion about that. Did he have from the other tribes? Is this something that he consolidated his strength with? And in the end, it doesn't really matter. He judged Israel for 7 years. Which is actually kind of short compared to some of the other ones. And verse 11, and after him, Elon, the Zebulunite, judged Israel, and he judged Israel 10 years. And Elon, the Zebulunite, died and was buried in Hilon in the land of Zebulun. And then after him, Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel, and he had 40 sons and 30 sons that rode on 70 donkey colts, or the other word. And then he judged Israel 8 years, and Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried in Pirathon in the land of Ephraim in the hill country of the Amalekites. And we are done with 12. So we've got some shorter periods, 7 years that we have, 10 years, and then 8 years. So we've got these areas where they're judging. And so you're having a period of 30 to 40 years, somewhere in that's happening between these judges. And then we run into the coming of Samson. So Judges 13, we're going to spend a little time in history. We're going to talk about the Philistines today. We're going to do a little bit more of a history lesson. I apologize for not having a ton of questions on this, because I think we need to kind of understand. We've just moved from one side of the Jordan in one area, and now we are moving back into another area where Ephraim would have been near Dan, really close to Jerusalem. And so we're going to need to do a little bit of history, which makes me happy. I don't know why that would be, but anyway. You can see here on the map Philistia, and this would have been some of the borders. At different times, this would have extended further north all the way to Mount Lebanon, which is actually, if we go up the map and we see, I can't really point it out on these screens, but if you go up to Sea of Galilee just a little bit further up, you're going to notice that's where Mount Lebanon. So they have some actual sway in the land, really from about 1200, roughly, all the way forward into where we are here with Samson. And so they're going to have some sway here. These are not a minor people. I want to make sure that you get this. This is not some little side group that's been here for a little bit of time. These people were very, very powerful. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Today, the word Philistine is actually from the Roman word that we get and how we get to the term in the modern day, Palestine. It was actually Emperor Hadrian who calls it Palestine, and it's actually their word for these people who are the Philistines. So when we talk about them being in the land, they definitely were. The Philistines, a people descended from Mizraim, a son of Ham. Who's Ham? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They are Noah's sons, and so we're seeing a direct descendant from one of Noah's sons.
The cursed son.
Yes, yes. They arrived in the area and had been classified as the sea people. Now, that's saying a lot, but you have sea people from Cyprus, you have them from Crete, you have typically, you call the Greeks, the Aegeans, sea peoples. So this can refer to a lot of those in what I'm going to call, and what historians call the Levant, or the Levantine Crescent, which is this border area here. I can't touch it. So anyway, it's the border area that shapes like a backwards crescent, or an outward crescent from the land of Philistia all the way up to Phoenicia. And then comes up into Turkey, goes down into Egypt where the Negev is. That's why it's shaped like a crescent. So we call this the Levantine Crescent. So these people, these sea peoples, were actually quite powerful. How powerful? Well, supposedly the Philistines were from, the Bible tells them they were from Caphtor. Caphtor is the island of Crete. And I think I've got a better, here we go. So we have these sea peoples. And what we find out about these sea peoples and the listing of these peoples that come into Philistia is that they partook in the downfall of Mycenae and Troy. So the story of the Iliad, if it is true, these people would have been there, or at least their descendants would have been there. The same people that would have been there. We're only talking about a few years. We're talking less than 100 years from those particular battles. These people are going to come into the land and establish themselves on the coastline where Gaza is, along the edge, which I think is fascinating. But even more fascinating is the only thing that stopped them from conquering all of these areas were the Egyptians. And they're recorded in Egyptian history all the way to Ramses III. If you don't know what that is, Ramses VI ends the new kingdom in essentially what we call the normal Egyptian rule. There's the old, the middle, and the new kingdom. And so when we talk about Ramses and we talk about how Joseph, possibly, if this is the connection that's being made, that would have been Ramses II. And they're talking about Ramses III. So you're talking about a people who actually fought this Egyptian power. Egypt wasn't weak during this period. From Ramses all the way down, they had agreements with the Hittites and had actually at least come to a stalemate with the Hittites, had come up through this land and actually controlled this land. So when we're talking about the Philistines, the one power that was able to actually stop them were the Egyptians, and they wrote about it all over the place, which is awesome. And I think that's really important for us, because you sit there and say, well, what's this going to matter for our story? It matters because when we talk about God going against these people, these are not some small band group of people. Sometimes you can almost see this when you think about the story of David and Goliath, that you see the giant there and you're not thinking about the mass army that's behind. And because of how quickly it's dispatched, you think, oh, these people aren't that strong. No. They are exceptionally strong, which tells us more about the power of God and his anointed. And that's cool. All right. So we have this story, the 5 big cities of them. And here is from Judges 3:3. These are the people in the land. And so you see here the Philistines on the bottom portion, and then the land of Canaanites. And then here is that Mount Lebanon that I was talking about. You go up past the Sea of Galilee where the Golan Heights. They ruled that entire area down through Mount Carmel and then continuing south all the way to Gaza. They controlled the area that even once the Phoenicians laid claim to. So even though we saw in that first map there was a very small area, at one time they were a major power along that coastline, okay? And the 5 cities that they would have had, that they call the Pentapolis, ruled by a lord for each city. These were Gaza, Gath, Ekron, Ashdod, and Ashkelon. All right, these are the 5 cities. And you're going to hear them again and again through Scripture talking about this. And I told you earlier that these people aren't going to be pushed out, excised from the land until all the way into the Maccabean revolt, which happens in the 184, I think, or 74 BC. So you're talking about, again, 1,000 years for these people to be in the land. It's a long time. And so some have suggested, again, as I mentioned before, that it was the lack of the Ephraimites that helped to keep them there. We'll see if that is. When Moses led Israel out of Egypt, let's go back a little further than that. Abraham, when he's there, he meets this king Abimelech. Sometimes Abimelech is associated with the pharaohs of Egypt, but he is actually the title, Abimelech. It actually is not necessarily his full-on name, and that is bore out later in Scripture, where they actually give a name. They call him Abimelech, but then there's an actual name given to him through that, and I think that's interesting. But anyway, Abraham, this is where he says, "Oh, Sarah is my sister," right? So we have evidence of them being in the land, at least at this time, using this, at least remnants of this, but not full on from what we were talking before. Then Moses led out of Egypt, and he comes through Gaza, and in Exodus 13:17 it says, "Avoid the way of the Philistines." All right? And the Exodus date being 1441. So we see again, there's this group that's already here, very powerful at about 1400, who's making their way, strengthening, and coming into the land. In the time of Judges, we are studying the Philistines were strong enough to be a continual threat. In fact, we have one judge who's already fought them. Who is it?
Shamgar?
It is Shamgar. That's exactly right. Definitely Shamgar. And then, of course, we read about the Philistines in the judgment of Samuel, the kingship of Saul, and the times of David, where it took David to completely subdue them in the land. Not get rid of them, but subdue them in the land, which is pretty impressive. Questions so far? All right. Later on, Nebuchadnezzar is going to stamp them out. Note that this happens in 604 BC. So you're talking roughly from the 1400s to the 600s. You're talking about 800 years. This is very much like what the Assyrians did when they came in, and the Neo-Babylonians first would come in, and they took people out of the land. They beat them, took them, and then deported them, typically to the 4 corners of the earth, which means not really the 4 corners of the earth, but the known land at that time. We also read about them with their religion. There were temples to Dagon, the fish god, in Gaza. Ashdod also had Dagon. One of Ashtaroth was in Ashkelon, and then one to Baal-zebub in Ekron. Now, I do find it interesting that in the Bible we learn a little bit more when they fought Israel and the ark, and they took the ark, so they were... something happens to them in Scripture. In fact, it's so bad that they want to do nothing else but get rid of the ark, and that's because there were plagues sent upon them. The first plague that we hear about is, they're called emerods, but it can mean a boil or a hemorrhoid that splits and splits again and splits again. And if you've never had hemorrhoids, let me tell you how bad that can be. And they have to actually send a golden hemorrhoid from each city and a golden rat or mice, because the plagues have broken out, and they had to send it back, and they had to give up the ark. So there's a lot that goes on with these. So I'm going to run down this so you can see this. This is just for illustration purposes, so you understand what a real story the Philistines are in the scriptures. Judges 13 through 16, we have Samson that we're going to be covering. 1 Samuel 4:6, Philistines capture the ark. We talked about this just a moment ago. 1 Samuel 17, David slays the giant Goliath from Gath. And it seems as though Goliath has children in which his own men, David's men, will have to actually fight. If they call it the sons of the giant, and there's speculation it could be Goliath. 1 Samuel 27-29, David lives in Gath, Acilia Philistia, during his times with Saul. 1 Samuel 31, Philistines are victorious in the battle of Saul, and all his sons are killed. 2 Samuel 21, Goliath is slain here again, but not by David. Fascinating story, by the way. Go back and read it, because I had to go back. I was like, I got to hear this story. I got to read this. 2 Kings, Philistines seem to have lost power. 1 Chronicles contains repeats of the stories already mentioned above. Isaiah 9 and 11, Philistines will reign, then be conquered by the Israelites. And Isaiah, folks. Think about how much later this is in the period, and they're still talking about the Philistines. Jeremiah 47 says the Philistines will be ruined by Egypt and their power is gone. Ezekiel 16, Israel conducts, will discuss even the Philistine women. And then, of course, Amos 1, God promises the destruction of the cities of Philistia, and they will happen. These people are long-lasting. They're in the land. They're difficult. And it's not because God cannot take care of them. It's simply because they allowed them to stay in the land. They did not wipe them out when they first came in. They rooted themselves in. We can talk about Ephraim and the attitude of the people, but they allowed these people who were very strong and very powerful to be in the land and put their stamp in that area of the land for 1,000 years. All right. Let's talk about Samson. I've got 2 minutes. Yes, sir.
You know, I've thought about this many times. God told them to get rid of those people. They didn't.
Yep.
Not only did they suffer then, they suffer today. They're going to suffer continuously because of that one thing they did not.
Yeah, you definitely can see the hand of that, right? All the way down through history, because they didn't want to obey or do what God had asked them to do. That's a powerful application for us too, because we might not see what's happening right now. I'm going to let my kids do X, or I'm going to go ahead and do this. This won't harm me. And you have no idea what's going to happen in a generation or 2 generations, or even down the road. And it's super important for us to be more thoughtful and more prayerful when we're dealing with that. Great point. All right, let's talk about, and this is the last thing because I have about 30 seconds. You're going to do the fun stuff.
I know I did.
Samson's character. His actions not only bear the stamp of adventure, foolhardiness, and willfulness, but there's a lot of these love affairs that are going on. He seems to be unable to control himself as a man. He dishonored and he fooled away the gift that God gave him. He was subservient to his own sensual heart and his lusts, and they prepared the way for his ruin. We often talk about the greatness of Samson, and the stories are incredible, the gift that God gave him. And we're going to see some amazing things. But like we talked about in all the other judges leading up to this point, each of them has a snare. They have a problem that they have to deal with. And Samson are these lusts. And I want to point out this because I think it's really neat. Literally, the area of land in which he lives and which he's going to move back and forth is called the Valley of Sorek. This is the area in which they brought back the grapes when they spied out the land and they were so worried about the area. It is considered to be one of the more sensual areas because of the wine that's produced there and because most of the Philistines had their area in this area. This is a low-level land, lots of water coming down into this area. And so what's really fascinating is that Samson is going to live, and he's going to go down and visit, and he's going to perform many of these acts in this pleasure valley, if you will, of the land of Sorek. And the unfortunate part is that it's going to ensnare him. And this is why it was so very dangerous. And I'm sure you'll get into more of that, but we kind of go through this. Let's go ahead and say a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for the time that we can go into your word and understand and try to pull some application for us in our lives. We thank you for the opportunity to search and seek out and understand in all kinds of contexts, to understand what is happening. But also, Lord, to know that you're in complete control. And it's not about us, and it's not about what I want to do or what I want to say, but it's about you. Let us be careful not to give in to our own selfish pride. Let's be careful not to want things right now because I deserve them. And let's be more mindful of you and your hand being on everything, and that you will do everything to make your plan work out, and that we just need to act. We just need to do what we're supposed to do, Lord. Put that into our hearts. Help us live this next week and all the weeks that are coming up in thoughtful preparation and prayerfulness, Lord, to you about what we need to do each and every day. Let's also be very thankful for everything that you've given us, but also for your Son, Jesus Christ. We can never give enough thanks. And we ask this in your Son, Jesus Christ's name. Amen.